Good afternoon, indeed, good morning or good evening, depending from where you're joining us. I'm Killian O'Brien, DAAD or German Academic Exchange Service Lecturer here at UCL Faculty of Laws, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you all to this UCL virtual seminar on recent European proposals to regulate shipping emissions. The vote on the 15th of September in the European Parliament in favour of enhanced regulation of the shipping sector caused, you'll perhaps forgive me the pun on this one, significant waves in a number of sectors and industries. In a very small nutshell, really, Parliament aims, among other things, to extend the scope of the EU emissions trading scheme to include the shipping industry. I'm going to leave the content on this, first of all, to the experts, and what I propose to do is very briefly introduce those experts to you, given the limited time available to do that we have today. Today we have the opportunity to discuss this proposal and other related topics with some leading experts in the area, each of whom represents an important stakeholder position in the ongoing debate. It's my privilege to welcome Jutta Paulus, member of the European Parliament for the Greens since 2019. Jutta is a member of the Committees on Environment, Public Health and Food Safety, Industry, Research and Energy, as well as the Transport Committee. And her name may be familiar to many of you as the rapporteur for the revision of the EU MRV regulation. After working for a number of years as a pharmacist and owning her own independent laboratory, Jutta became the regional co-president of the Greens in Rhineland-Palatinate from 2017 to 2019. And her political work is focused on climate, energy and environmental challenges. One of her main aims being to ensure that the European Union takes effective action against climate change. I should also like to welcome Professor Dr. Alexander Prölz, who holds the chair in the International Law of the Sea and International Environmental Law, as well as Public International Law and Public Law at the Faculty of Law of the University of Hamburg. Prior to his move to Hamburg, Alexander was Professor for Public Law, in particularly Public International Law and European Law at Trier University, where he also acted as Director of the Institutes of Environmental Law and for Legal Policy, respectively. And before that, he held a chair in Public International Law at the University of Kiel. International environmental law, and it goes without saying, the international law of the sea, constitute the focal point of his research. And Alexander has been a member of several national and international research consortia, as well as regularly advising state agencies, international organizations, and NGOs, both at home in Germany and abroad. From the perspective of the shipping industry, Simon Bergolf also joins us today. Simon joined AP Møller-Mærsk as Director of Regulatory Affairs in 2017, and he's responsible for Maersk's positioning and outreach on key regulatory topics, including climate change and environmental issues. Before joining Maersk, Simon headed the Danish Shipowners Association's Brussels representation between 2009 and 2017, where he was the Director for EU Affairs. Prior to that, Simon worked as a public affairs consultant with Hill and Knowlton in Brussels, and he holds qualifications from the Université Libre de Bruxelles and the Universitat de Granada, as well as from the Institut Supérieur de Management Public et Politique Européen. Simon, you're most welcome today, and I'm glad you can be with us. Once our panelists have concluded with their remarks, there'll be a comment today, which will be given by Faik Abbasov, who is the Director of Shipping Policy at Transport and Environment, a Brussels-based sustainable transport group, which advocates for sustainable transport policies in the EU and internationally. Faik holds a PhD in European energy policy and has a specialized technical training in ship energy efficiency and EU energy market regulation. His main areas of expertise are zero emission maritime technologies and fuels, air pollution and GHG emissions from shipping, as well as ship design standards, MBMs, and environmental challenges surrounding Arctic shipping. And thank you indeed to you too, Faik, for taking the time to join us today as well. Just very briefly before I hand over to our first speaker, a word or two on the running order today. Each speaker will have in the region of 10 to 12 maximum 15 minutes to make their remarks. And thereafter, we'll have the comment by Faik, and this will be followed by time for questions and discussion. I should note that we have received a significant number of questions in advance, and the aim is to try to get to as many of those questions as possible in the time we have available to us. And please do feel free to post additional questions using the chat function as we move along, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those as we can too. Two other things briefly. As you may have noticed, this session is being recorded, so please be aware of that, and a link will be made available to you as soon as possible afterwards. And second, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that this meeting is taking place under Chatham House rule, meaning that you should please feel free to use any information received today, but please refrain from making the identity of the affiliation indeed of the speaker or any other participant available with that information. Now, with all that out of the way, it is my pleasure to ask MEP Jutta Paulus to take the virtual floor.
Thank you very much, Killian. Thank you for organizing this interesting event and, of course, for inviting me to give an intervention. I think most of those that are listening to this event are pretty much familiar with the shipping industry and the shipping sector. Back to where I come from, I haven't been a politician for a very long time. Actually, I took up office last year, as you correctly said, but before I have been a CEO in a chemical laboratory, and I hold a degree in pharmacy, so I do have a bit of a scientific background. And when I entered Parliament, and fortunately was attributed to the file on the CO2 emissions from shipping, I learned very much about this very interesting sector, paying a visit to Rotterdam, talking with ship owners, ship operators, port authorities, also NGOs, researchers. So I do believe that I did my best to get a good impression of the sector. And when I found this Commission proposal on the revision of the MRV guideline, I was a bit taken aback because everyone is speaking about the climate crisis, but the proposal was only saying, okay, we'll just keep on counting the emissions and we will not do anything about them. And that was my starting point to say, okay, now that we have this very good and valuable and validated data on the CO2 emissions from shipping, now we have to do something about it. We had very fruitful shadows meetings with my colleagues from other political groups, and finally we reached compromise where we are saying we want an efficiency goal for shipping, meaning that the CO2 emissions per transport work should be reduced by 40% until 2030. Taking the baseline 2018-2019 from the existing MRV data, and the Commission should find a way to take into account those that have already done a lot, although of course those that have already done a lot in reducing their emissions will have a much smaller way to go, so to speak, because the 40% emission reduction is not per ship but per fleet. So if you're already a leader in your group, for example, if you operate the very most efficient container ships, then you only have to cover the remaining pathway to the 40% if you're already 20% or 30% below the current average. And we're being technology open, saying this emission reduction can be achieved through, for example, wind propulsion in addition to an engine, or you could put on a very efficient hull, or you could change your turbine, or you could just go slower. This doesn't cost anything in money, but you, because V square, so if you reduce your speed by 20%, you save 40% of fuel approximately. So this is the technology open approach which we took in our proposal. And the second big issue is that we want shipping to be included in the ETS, the emission trading scheme of the European Union. which has already been announced also by Ursula von der Leyen and Franz Timmermans. But we thought that while we have a shipping file on the table, we could as well do it now and not wait for a separate proposal, because there already is an impact assessment on this issue dated 2013, but the ETS prices are still within the range that was looked at in the impact assessment. So there hasn't changed a lot there. Speaking more broadly, I shouldn't forget the other issues. We're also calling for a Commission proposal for zero emission ports, and we're calling for counting methane emissions also in the MRV register. Methane emissions becoming more and more important. The IMO having published a study that shows that these have gone up by 150% in the last years, methane slippage from ships, of course, because there are more and more LNG ships underway, transport, as well as ships that are being powered by LNG. So these are the main points from our proposal. We had a very broad majority in the Environmental Committee, and we had a broad majority also in plenary by over 500 votes. So now we will be awaiting trilogues, and the German presidency has already said, well, they will try to fit it in, but up to now they're very much engaged with, of course, budget and Brexit and climate law. So this will be a difficult task to get this negotiated anytime soon. But to speak a bit broader about the issue, the shipping sector is one of those that has miraculously escaped any responsibility for the last 30 years or almost 30 years. I actually have found a document from 1994 saying that for the time being, the shipping sector should not be subject to the emission reduction pledges that were laid down at the conference of Rio. So this is quite interesting, because this, for the time being, has not changed ever since. And the shipping sector, taking place mainly on the high seas, is of course always in international waters and under no single national state's jurisdiction. And so the approach that we are taking by pricing the fuel, which is not subject to any tax yet, pricing the fuel under the emission trading system is more or less a crutch, because we have been waiting for IMO action for so long, and up to my impression, there is nothing happening anytime soon, and therefore there will always have to be trailblazers when it comes to climate action, and the EU should do this trailblazing in the shipping sector, because the fact that we have the port state authority issue here, so that every ship that wants to enter port has to behave, so to speak, to the port's jurisdiction. That's a very good possibility also to prevent carbon leakage, because if we had a tax on fuel, you would only need one single port that does not want to have the tax. So if we had a tax on bunker fuel in the EU, for example, then ships could maybe go to Southampton or to St. Petersburg or to Algiers or to wherever and fuel up there, and they could thus escape the pricing of the fuel. And even if we had an agreement at the level of the IMO, as far as I know, maybe I'm mistaken, so I'm very glad that we have a legal expert here, the IMO doesn't have any possibility to actually enforce the agreement on taxing bunker fuel. And I guess if this would be the case at any time, that there would be a global tax on bunker fuel, then of course we would have to speak about the emission trading system again. But until now, I don't see this coming within the next 5 or 10 years. So I think the best possibility to start action now is by putting shipping into the ETS, collecting money. This money, of course, will will be part of it will go into the budget of the European Union, where we urgently need own resources, and the other half will go into an ocean fund. And this ocean fund is supposed to be used for efficiency, innovation, research and development, and also for financing marine protection areas, which are not in very good state, if I'm honest. So we are using the money that is taken from the sector to actually help the sector decarbonize. And if you do the math on what IMO wants to do with their innovation fund, the EU fund would be much larger than the IMO fund. So we could actually do much more about the decarbonization of the sector with our approach. So I really hope that we will find a majority also among the member states, which have not yet discussed about this proposal, as far as I take it, because then we could really have a big step forward. Ships are on the seas, as you all know, for at least 20 years, sometimes 30, 40, 50 years. So if we want to become carbon neutral by 2050 at the latest, the time to act is now. Thanks very much for having me, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Jutta. I would just perhaps ask one question directly before we move on, and it comes through the chat that's just come in at the moment, and it goes to the discussion on other sectors that are possibly being included within the EU ETS will take place in 2021, and as we move forward on that, the question asks whether the MRV regulation is actually the right place to address this, and whether it's possible to do so, whether you conclude a request for another directive on a completely other regulation, and how would you see that before we then perhaps move on?
Well, actually, this argument was put forward during our shadows meetings too, saying, well, proper legislation would be to have a separate proposal only on ETS, but we are doing this all the time. I mean, we've had countless proposals or legislative proposals on our table that say, and also in directive number so and so and so, article blah, blah, blah is amended as follows. So this is, this looks weird, but it's actually happening all the time in all sorts of legislative proposals.
Thank you very much. So that we can get further deeper into the content of it, I think it might be apt at this point if we move on to our next speaker, Alexander Preuß, who might give us a broad outline of some of the more legal issues surrounding it, and that might give us a framework for the rest of the discussion as we move forward, I think. Alexander.
Thanks very much, Killian, and thanks for the kind invitation to participate in this important event, which I'm really very much enjoying in joining all of you. Now, in my brief presentation, I'm going to focus on the second big issue, as MEP Paulus referred to it, which means the inclusion of ship emissions in the EU emissions trading system. First and secondly, I'm not going to discuss whether the EU should actually act as a trailblazer, again, to use Jutta's vocabulary, but rather whether it is entitled to do so and what kind of limitations could appear. I'm going to share my screen with you in order to find out, in order to demonstrate my messages. You should see the screen now. Killian, does that work? Yes, it's wonderful. Now, just give me 1 second, it doesn't move. There we go. I'm going to start with a very brief overview about the relevant activities of the IMO first, and then move on to the EU. I'm doing that in light of the fact that with the IMO, we do have a global actor in place, an international organization which is responsible for the regulation of shipping, which is per se a global business. When doing so, I think it is helpful to recall that the Kyoto Protocol indeed contained a reference to the reduction of emissions of greenhouse gases with regard to the shipping industry in Article 2, Para 2, stating that the parties, and I quote, shall pursue limitation or reduction of emissions of greenhouse gases not controlled by the Montreal Protocol from aviation and marine bunker fuels, working through the ICAO and the International Maritime Organization, respectively. There's no mentioning of the shipping sector in the Paris Agreement. So from that perspective, this provision is still relevant. And the question is, does that actually mean that regulation should actually focus on the IMO and not conducted in other fora, such as the European Union? Or is that simply a reference to the existing international organization, which was held to be the competent body at the time when the Kyoto Protocol was developed and negotiated? Now, what has the IMO so far done? Now, this, of course, is very superficial. Many other steps were taken, which I'm not going to mention, but it probably all started with a 2004 IMO resolution in which the Marine Environmental Protection Committee was called upon to identify and develop mechanisms which could help to achieve limitations or reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from international shipping. And that happened in 2012 when the NEPC came up with the guidelines on two mechanisms, namely the Energy Efficiency Development Index and the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan for new ships, the first one, and for new and existing ships, the second category. This has meanwhile been made legally binding as of the 1st January 2013 by inclusion as new chapter into the MARPOL agreement, an international binding treaty addressing pollution from ships. I'm going to refer to that again. Now, the debate speeded up with the 2018 IMO resolution as initial strategy on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from ships. And here, I think the IMO actually referred to quite an ambitious level. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but it is quite interesting to see that the IMO recognized that greenhouse gas emissions from international shipping ought to peak as soon as possible and that they're to reduce by at least 50% by 2050 compared to 2008. Reference has already been made to a proposal of the shipping industry to establish an international maritime research and development board, a mechanism by which the industry has accepted that it indeed also has responsibility with regard to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. This is something which will be dealt with in the next, probably at least, MAPC meeting, but we need to wait until any kind of decision has been taken on it. Again, because of time, I'm not going to delve into any detail on this, but that may happen during the discussion. You may ask yourself, does the IMO framework actually cover the regulation of greenhouse gas emissions? My answer is clearly yes. CO2 emissions are to be considered as pollution in terms of the International Law of the Sea, both under the Law of the Sea Convention, which is the, as it is often referred to, Constitution for the Oceans, and the international treaty which governs the prevention of pollution by ships. It is also considered to be a harmful substance under the very treaty, which I'm referring to under the acronym MARPOL. Keep in mind that the 6th annex of MARPOL is actually dealing with the prevention of air pollution from ships, which really makes it clear that all this is within the regime of the IMO, and indeed there are precedents, in particular fund-based solutions, which demonstrate that the IMO framework may also extend to market-based or economic mechanisms. So from that perspective, there's really not that much of a legal problem. So let's then shift to the EU. Again, some background information first, which I think is very important to keep in mind when addressing the role of the EU as an actor in international relations. And that is what it is doing if it attempts to regulate conduct that goes beyond the European Union sensu stricto. The EU is a party to the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, Paris, the UN Convention for the Law of the Sea, but not, and that does indeed create some legal questions to the MARPOL Convention. And it cannot be, taking into account that ratification and accession to that convention is reserved to states. That said, all EU member states are state parties to that very convention, which again brings up the question, what happens if the member states are bound to certain international legal obligations and then the EU starts regulating on that very specific subject matter? If the EU is becoming a party to an international treaty, such as it has done with the UNFCCC and the other mentioned conventions, then these treaties are binding upon the institutions of the EU as well as on the member states, a message which is contained in one of the articles of the Treaty for the Functioning of the European Union. What has the EU done so far? Of course, the EU ETS is the basis of what we are discussing here with Directive 23/87. It has, as you will all know, established a cap and trade system, a maximum set on the total amount of greenhouse gases that can be emitted by the participating installations, which as of today do not include the shipping sector. And then allowances for emissions are auctioned off. There is no free allocation anymore. There used to be in the first two phases of the regime, and these can subsequently be traded depending on the record concerning emissions and CO2 emissions of the institution and operator concerned. Aviation is an interesting parallel on which I will draw during a couple of seconds. It was indeed included into the EU ETS by way of another directive. And then, unsurprisingly, probably this caused strong reactions from companies and non-European Union member states following a development that led to a suspension of the inclusion of non-European air traffic in the EU ETS in order to find an international-based solution. And quite similar to the situation with shipping, a competent international organization exists, which is the ICAO, which in 2016 agreed to introduce what it calls CORSIA, an offsetting regime climate protection instrument, which is of course not the same as an emissions trading system sensu stricto, and it is very difficult today to assess whether or not that instrument will be effective or not. So far, the maritime sector, I said this before, has not been introduced into the EU ETS. Let us keep in mind, however, that it is not the only sector which hasn't. Road transport has so far not been included into the system, and that has inclusion of it has actually been rejected by inter alia, the EU Parliament, which is, of course, gives rise to the question, why should we deal differently with different sectors, which may, subject to discussion, be quite similar with regard to the actors concerned, as well as the dependency on global rules and standards. It's interesting then to have a look at the recital of yet another directive, which has made it very clear that essentially all sectors of the economy should indeed be included into the entire climate change regime of the EU, and that refers directly to international maritime shipping and aviation. And that very directive then refers to the IMO in express terms. Let me quote this section stating that in the event that no international agreement which includes international maritime emissions in its reduction targets through the IMO has been approved by the member states, or no such agreement through the UNFCCC has been approved by the community by 31st of December 2011, the Commission should make a proposal to include these emissions into the regime. So the question that we're discussing today is actually not really that new. Reference has already been made, of course, to the MRV scheme established by the 2015 regulation, which indeed applies to all ships, depending on the size of the ships. And again, one of the recitals of that regulation considers the system that has been established so far, referring to monitoring, reporting, and verification obligations, that this would only be the first step of a staged approach for the inclusion of maritime transport emissions in the entire EU greenhouse gas reduction commitment. Now, the most important point, and then I'm going to wrap this up, is the EU actually entitled to regulate the inclusion of CO2 emissions from ships in the EU ETS? I'd say from an internal EU perspective, the answer is clearly yes. The EU has the legal basis to do so, depending on where exactly the main focus of the legislative act concerned will be. It is either the power concerning protection of the environment or the power concerning transport and shipping. And indeed, this would in both situations result in application of the ordinary legislative procedure. But what about then potential limitations that arise from the international law of the sea, and in particular the Law of the Sea Convention, to which, as I said before, the EU is a party to? Now, I'd say principally the EU actually has jurisdiction to regulate and enforce. I'm not going to delve into the details on this, simply because it may become a little too technical, so I'm going to skip this. And then the point that I think is probably the most important is that whenever a coastal state, and that as a party to the Law of the Sea Convention includes the EU, actually has the competence to subject foreign ships which are calling at their ports, at the European ports, to stricter environmental standards. Why that? Because the ports are subject of the full territorial sovereignty of the states, and provided that the EU does indeed have the competence to regulate and enforce, and I tried to demonstrate before that it does so, this competence can indeed be applied by the EU. Okay, so as a matter of principle, the Law of the Sea Convention does not legally prevent the EU from taking unilateral action vis-a-vis foreign ships. I'm emphasizing foreign ships here because obviously it does not need any further explanation that the EU is indeed entitled to regulate conduct of European flagged ships. That doesn't need to be dealt with in more detail. A particularly delicate question is the following. How do we deal with the fact that global shipping is not limited to European waters? Can we include the entire journey of a ship when it comes to how to deal with the emissions of that ship into the EU trading scheme, or should that be limited to the European waters? Now, this is a question essentially referring to whether or not the EU is entitled under international law to exercise extraterritorial jurisdiction, because the effects go beyond the territory of the EU sensu stricto. As most of you will know, the Court of Justice of the EU had no problem to accept such broad regulatory and enforcement powers in its famous aviation case, in which it argued that the sheer fact that a ship is pulling at one of the ports on EU territory is sufficient in order to give rise to the broad regulatory powers of the EU. This has not been shared by everyone in legal scholarship, to put it in these words, and I have to confess that I had been critical about that decision because it doesn't really give a lot of reasoning on the matter concerned, but nevertheless, this is where we stand. And there seems to be a general tendency in state practice to accept broader regulatory and enforcement powers over ships at the occasion of a voluntary stay in a port. My last point then, is there any other limitations for unilateral action of the EU in relation to the EU member states which may arise from EU law? This has been discussed at length with regard to the phasing out of single hulls following the disasters of the oil tankers of the Erika and the Prestige. Again, the Court of Justice of the EU has taken a very pro-European autonomy-based approach in the Intertanko decision by saying that since the EU is not a party to MARPOL, it doesn't have to respect the rights and obligations contained therein. And that indeed is, again, subject to debate. However, the difference to the situation here is that as of today, we do not have any prescriptions on the IMO level concerning greenhouse gas emissions, which is why I think there cannot be any legal conflict. Now, with that, I think I'd stop. My main message is, from a European law perspective, there doesn't seem to be any legal obstacles concerning the approach advocated by the Parliament, and notwithstanding some uncertainties, the same message can probably be given with regard to limitations arising from public international law. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alexander. I would ask one direct question. To what extent, though, is the argument concerning prescriptive and enforcement jurisdiction of port states moot, to the extent that the ship by entering that port itself, has consented to whatever regime specifically applies. It's an argument that comes up a lot and has been, been advanced over the years for a number of years now.
Sure.
It keeps coming up.
Sure, exactly. That is the regular argument that is brought forward. The question is, what is the nexus? What kind of conduct do you want to regulate? Is that a conduct which specifically refers to or has taken place in an area beyond national jurisdiction? And I think the argument can be made that this is true with regard to emissions that take place outside of European waters. Can you really use that as the starting point for regulation, right? The European Court of Justice has said, yes, that's possible, and didn't see any big problem with that. I think the situation is a little more complex than as was dealt with all due respect, of course, by the judges of the CGEU. But nevertheless, as I said, there seems to be a comparatively flexible approach, which is the dominating one in state practice, which then makes it possible, essentially allocating very, very broad powers to the port state, or in the case of the EU, to the European Union.
Thank you so much for that. There's a number of questions coming in, and Simon is our next speaker, but I would just mention two of those questions because I'm sure it's something that's relevant to the remarks he's about to make, and they're going to the notion of alternative fuels, in particular how much fuels like ULSFO and VLSFO can actually reduce carbon emissions, and whether there are in fact technologies available that can reach a 40% emissions reduction without going immediately into the area of electric fuels. And I don't wish to in any way prescribe what you should be saying anyway, Simon. I hope you don't perceive it as such. But those are two questions which have come up, which I thought maybe are quite well suited to the remarks you might make in any case. Thanks very much.
There you go. Thank you. And let me see if I can share my screen with you. And whilst it's doing that, let me thank you first of all for the kind invitation and the very timely meeting here that you're hosting, because it is truly a very important topic, and I think that it's reflected by the amount of people attending here. And I'd just like to echo one of the points that Jutta Paulus made in her intervention. Time is of the essence here, and it truly is. So couldn't agree more on that. Let me start maybe by just saying a few words about Maersk. Maersk is a global company. We operate 700 ships in total across 130 countries. We have 76,000 employees. These lines that you see on the map here are where our ships are trading. So it is truly a global company, and Europe is a small part of what we're doing, but obviously an essential part. And we're based in lovely Copenhagen. We operate 700 ships, and that obviously comes with a substantial footprint, both in terms of climate change, both in terms of emissions, also when we look at other types of emissions than just greenhouse gases. It's something that we take very seriously. We have 2 to 3%. That's not just Maersk, that's the whole shipping sector, of course. 2 to 3% of the global emissions are coming from shipping. And just to put that in perspective, that's the same amount as a country like Germany. So the sector itself has a massive footprint and obviously has to deliver and be part of the solution to deliver the reductions. It has been mentioned a couple of times that shipping wasn't included in the Paris Agreement. It's to our biggest regret that we are not included in that. I think that Maersk and others from the beginning called for the inclusion of shipping. And we would not be in the situation we are today if we were included. It's as simple as that. I mean, I'm happy to go into more details on that one, but if shipping is not part of the national member states credit system for how much CO2 they are credited with when they reduce. And that also means that for a hard to abate sector like shipping, we obviously are in a situation that's more complicated because the focus is less on our sector. In 2018, we decided at Maersk to launch our own climate change strategy, which is shown here on these slides. The idea here is to have a net zero and a decarbonization of our sector by 2050. but we also wanted to have a number of steps in between, and one of the important ones is to have a commercially viable net zero ship on the seas by 2030. The important part of that sentence is commercially viable, because obviously there are zero emission ships on the seas today. There's one between Helsingør and Helsingborg, and a number of other ones being produced. They are mainly electrified vessels and smaller vessels, but we have 400 meters long vessels. So of course, it's not exactly the same type of technology that we can use. And that may be to one of the questions that I asked: is there a technology right now that can get us on the path? Not immediately, though, I would say. How do we then make sure that we reach these targets? The first one is a customer engagement. It's extremely important for us to make sure that our customers are with us on this voyage, and I'll get back to that in a second. There's a huge amount of need for research and development, but also deployment and innovation. It's something that the sector really needs, because as I've said to a number of people beforehand, we're facing the third revolution of shipping. So we had wind to steam, steam to oil, and oil to whatever we come up with now. And we don't know what we need to come up with now. So there's an enormous amount of R&D needed. And finally, and quite importantly, and I'm not just saying that because I'm in charge of regulatory affairs, there's a need for a very solid policy framework, because we know how this sector operates in general, and we know how things are pressed forward. So we need a global framework that's actually pushing us in the right direction. So that's the last part of these three elements. Once we launched our strategy, we began to look into what is it exactly that we can do to achieve these targets we set for ourselves. Let me start with the picture of the vessel, because honestly, the technical elements that we can do, and some of them were also mentioned by previous speakers, in terms of changing of engine, of bulbous bow, of the hull shape, etc. For Maersk, in all honesty, we're coming to the limits of what we can do from a technical perspective. We've been doing this for the past 10 years, and our ships are as efficient as they can be for now from a technical perspective. So we need to look at an operational perspective, and we need to look at what we put in there and what type of fuels we're sailing on. So one of the first things we did was create a new product, and that goes back to the customer angle, where we used cooking oil to blend in our very low sulfur oil at 30% blend, and we're sailing on that. That's a premium service that we are giving our customers, and that also means that it comes as an additional cost for our customers. And that's an interesting point, because up until now there was a lot of large companies highlighting how important the supply chain footprint was to them, but in essence, very few of them were then ready to actually commit to paying additional fees for getting lower emissions on the supply chain. But now what we're seeing is that commitment is there, particularly from fast-moving consumer goods companies. They're very interested in this. It's actually going quite well. And another thing that's changed is that we now have a situation where when we are in meetings with the customers, it's no longer just a procurement officer that's there. It's also someone from the sustainability department that's present. That changes the dialogue that we have with our customers. So that's a fundamental change we've seen over the past years. We're also working on a project on biofuels where we're doing lignin and ethanol blends. It's a LEO project. Right now it's still at laboratory stage, but we hope that this can actually yield some quite good benefits, because there we would then move to zero emission shipping or close by, whereas the used cooking oil, of course, is not going to bring us to zero. We're working on batteries, not for our deep sea operations, but for port operations. So if we could switch to batteries in port, we would, of course, take out the emissions when we're in port. And the last one is digitization. There's a huge amount to be saved by right steaming. So we're not supportive of speed reductions, but we are supportive of steaming at the right speed, which is not the same. When you are leaving a port, and that's including in Europe, you you sail quite fast to get to the next port, and often you end up sitting outside of the port for hours or days. And if you could just have that information ahead of time and just take your time to get to that port, there's a massive amount of CO2 that can be saved there. And it's not exactly rocket science. So it's about digitalization. Let me go a little bit into what's going on at IMO level, and thank you, Alexander, for giving the really good framework of what's going on. I'll give you just a perspective from a shipping company. What we're seeing right now is a lot of focus on short-term measures, unfortunately. And I say unfortunately because I feel a little bit that we are steering, we can't see the forest for trees. It would be nice if we could actually move forward on the more long-term measures, but we needed to start with the short-term measures. It's just unfortunate that it's taking so long time. They are split in two different categories: the technical measures, which are the design index, that applies only to new build ships, but for container ships, for example, that means from 2022, all our new container ships that we're building will have to be on average 40% more efficient for new build. So in essence, you can say container shipping is delivering the IMO target in 2022 for new builds. For existing ships, that's a very different scenario. So what can we do there in terms of the technical measures? As I said, that's limited, but there is a possibility to look at power limitation. And again, power limitation is much better than speed limitation because you actually enable to reward energy efficient ships by limiting their power and not their speed. Then we have the operational measures. We have a goal-based approach by EU states that is pushing in, which is also a technological neutral approach, which is basically giving a basket of possibilities for ship owners, a toolbox for them to respect the IMO targets. And then we have other member states that are pushing for performance ratings. So a little bit like cars or fridges for that matter, you have ships and the way they're operating, you would have a rating from A to E. What's going on now is we're trying to merge these technical and operational measures. We're trying to merge all the different solutions, and in a couple of weeks, actually, those will be discussed in IMO, and hopefully we can move forward. We still need to focus on research, development, and deployment. Again, I'm very supportive of the research board. I realize that in terms of monies collected, it's not at the same level as the EU, but there's a big difference. It's private money. So that means that it can be used as a capital investment. It's far more flexible. So let's just, no, it is, you can shake your head, but it is. And then we have to look at, we cannot say that it's definitely not a market-based measure, because at the price that it is, it's not going to shift anything from one thing to another, and that's not the aim of it. So we still need to have a market-based measure. And that's being teed up right now. Actually, very good study by Trafigura that came out just this week. So I would encourage everyone to read it. It's very interesting. And the last point is we really have to need to look at the impact on states, because we are not going to move this forward without having a look at how this will impact particularly developing states. From an EU perspective, quite a lot of moving parts right now. And as you'll see, this is a neat puzzle where every single piece is fitting nicely together. I wish that was exactly the case in Brussels, but it's not exactly the case. We feel sometimes that some of the things that are being put forward maybe would benefit from looking at what is going on elsewhere. I'm not going to go into every single one of these. It's more to give an idea of what's happening in our sector in Brussels. Very supportive of the MRV. We continue to be so. I think it's a good framework. It's a good way of collecting data. It's a good data elements that are in there. We only have 1 year right now, but it will be built as a solid data set eventually, for sure. Discussion on the ETS, we're going into that. Quite a lot happening there as well. Very difficult right now to just see how that will pan out, but looking forward to the impact assessment, so we have an idea about that. Fuels EU, broadening the supply of green fuels or renewable fuels at European level, extremely useful initiative as well. But again, how will it pan out? Will it be fuel blending or not? That's a big question. And how will it be in terms of a fleet approach or not, which is an important part of it. And the last one is the RED 3, which is the Renewable Energy Directive, which is very important for our sector as well, because again, shipping hasn't really been very prominently put in the second version of that. I've been asked to look a little bit into the impact on international negotiations, and it's a very interesting point actually. And let me start by saying, and I've said this before also, but Europe has really a fundamental role in IMO. It truly has. And we've had a number of meetings now where I'm fortunate enough to participate. And when I'm there, the member states are there, all the European member states are nearly there, the ones with maritime interest anyway. The European Commission is very well represented across DGs. We had the pleasure of having a few members of parliament participating when it was still physical meetings. Hopefully we can return to that at some point. But there is truly a need for consistency in the approaches that we're taking at EU level and at international level. And I live in Denmark now, and one of the things that frustrates me tremendously about living in Denmark is how the press is handling EU affairs. And I know I'm talking to also a British audience, so you will have to bear with me for this part. But what frustrates me really is this: Brussels has decided this, Brussels has decided that, and Denmark is fully part of these discussions in the Council, in the European Parliament. There's no Brussels has decided this. And there's this mentality about saying down in Brussels. They use that in Danish. Down in Brussels, they have decided this. You never say down in Hamburg or down in Paris, but down in Brussels, right? And I'm a little worried that we have the same situation when we talk about IMO, but from the Brussels perspective. So over in London, they can't get their act together. Over in London, they're very slow. Let me just say this again, that like a failure of IMO is also a failure of the EU. It's as simple as that. We have as much a need to ensure progress at IMO as Europe and as European companies, for that matter, than just thinking it's okay if that doesn't go well. A couple of other points before I close is that, of course, we always compared with a lot of different sectors, and I think that's a dangerous path to go in. Shipping is not aviation; it's very different. But shipping is also not shipping. So container ships are not cruise ships, and cruise ships are not fishing vessels. And that's still, some of the questions that we're getting don't really reflect that from time to time. Let me reiterate the fact that developing countries and the way that they have to be included in this at international level is extremely important. The impact on developing countries is one that we cannot just, brush aside because we want to push a specific agenda. What we can do and what we should do is just look at what we can do at European level to create this opportunity that is there right now. I'm a firm believer in the fact that the third revolution of shipping is a fantastic opportunity to actually create growth in Europe, including economic and business growth. I mean, we are not exactly leaders in a lot of areas anymore in Europe. I think we have to accept that. But here's one that where we really could. I mean, we could really come up with this silver bullet and actually have a thorough impact on what's going on at EU level if it's done properly. So I truly believe that there could be some European champions there in the making if we focus on that. Yeah, that's all I had. I look very much forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon, for those insightful comments. With half an eye, or indeed maybe one full eye on the rapidly advancing time, I'll move straight on to the comment, I think, from Faik, and then we can get into the discussion, and perhaps that's the best way to move forward. So Faik, please.
Thank you, Killian. And thank you very much for all the presenters. Very interesting discussions. As you can imagine, I had preliminary speech or a couple of points that I would like to raise, but as a commentator, you normally chuck them out the window after hearing the interventions of other speakers and concentrate on the points that they have raised that you find interesting. With that in mind, I will concentrate on 4 issues which I believe are important to stress towards the conclusion and towards the end of this webinar. One issue is, very importantly, the question of who has the responsibility for shipping's decarbonization or shipping emissions, and what does the Paris Agreement as the successor to Kyoto Protocol say about this? I think it is pretty clear, and nobody ever disputes that, the fact that IMO has responsibility for decarbonizing shipping and regulating shipping as a whole. But the key word there is IMO does not have exclusive responsibility to do that. So the two are two different things. IMO has a responsibility, but IMO is not the only organization or only actor who's capable or who has the right, the jurisdiction to do so. And that's where Paris Agreement is very interesting. Professor Paulus correctly pointed out that Kyoto Protocol had an explicit reference to International Maritime Organization as well as ICAO, which is aviation's international regulator, Paris Agreement does not have such a reference. But I would argue that Paris Agreement did not need such a reference, because Article 4 of Paris Agreement says states need to come up with economy-wide nationally determined contributions. Shipping, as well as aviation, is part of the economy. As such, states are implicitly asked to include shipping as well as aviation emissions in their nationally determined contributions, NDCs, as it is known. Today, European NDC to the IMO, which is minus 40% by 2030, includes all sectors except one, that is international shipping. It already includes international aviation. All outbound emissions, starting from Europe, is in the EU's 2030 target. Intra-EU as well as extra-EU outbound, it's already there. What is not in there is shipping for the moment, and that is what the European Commission communication that was published last week or the week before is trying to fill in that gap. So Paris Agreement gave a mandate to states to regulate shipping, and United Nations Convention of the Law of the Seas, as Professor explained, gives the jurisdiction for the states or regions regulate ships calling at their ports under port state control. At this point, I would like to clarify one thing. Europe has not included yet shipping in its climate target, but Europe does regulate shipping. And this is a key statement because we have MRV regulation. MRV regulation is the first step that is based on the port state control jurisdiction, regulate ships calling at European ports. But it does so only taking the first step by asking them to report their emissions. In that sense, Europe has already taken the first step in carving out part of the pie that it can eventually include in its contributions under the Paris Agreement, especially when the European Union is going to revise its 2030 target. This is very important to clarify. And the second issue I would like to point out, there was one question, I don't know whether it came from the audience or whether from you, Killian, that road transport is not in the EU emissions trading scheme, and the European Parliament position is that not to include road transport in the EU ETS. This is correct statement. What is important to consider is ETS is one of the many instruments in the EU for climate action. It's not the exclusive one. It's one of the many. For road transportation, there are two additional instruments. One is called car CO2 standards. That's also defined by the European Union. That is a EU law which decides how much CO2 cars, the new cars sold in the European market, are allowed to emit. And secondly, there is something called taxation. We all know this. Taxation is an indirect form of carbon pricing. Today, ETS CO2 price is 25 to 30 euros. But if you consider taxation of fossil fuels as indirect carbon pricing, today in Belgium, in my country, we're paying about 180 euros per ton of CO2 indirect carbon pricing when we buy petrol or gasoline at the petrol station. So cars already have those two regulations, and the European Parliament rightly considers that concentrating all the political effort on those two elements is much better outcome as opposed to taking the pressure of taxation as well as CO2 standard and putting shipping in the ETS. So this is the difference between the two sectors. Shipping, unlike cars, is tax-free. There's no fuel taxes paid by shipping. And doing it through EU tax directive is a big challenge because it requires unanimity. So ETS is an indirect way of applying taxation to shipping fuel. But this is a direct carbon pricing. The third issue, there was a question raised, 40% reduction target of the IMO by 2030. Do we need new fuels to achieve that? The short answer is no, because the IMO target was decided in 2018, requiring 40% improvement by 2030 compared to 2008 level. Over the summer 2020, IMO published its fourth greenhouse gas study, which revealed that ships had already improved their efficiency by 30% between 2008 and 18. So even before the IMO adopted its target, they were 3/4 through that target. They were already there. So market forces were already delivering those reductions, even without relying on new technologies. Slow steaming and increasing ship sizes were the primary two reasons why ships have improved such dramatic extent their efficiency. So in that sense, what does it say? From an environmental perspective, the organization I represent, that means the IMO's 2030 target was inadequate, and it still remains inadequate. Even in a business as usual cases, IMO fourth greenhouse gas studies concluded that it is likely that market in itself will deliver that target without regulatory intervention. And that's the fourth point that I would like to go to and conclude on that point. I fully agree with what Simon said. The policy framing, solid, stable policy framework is essential to drive the technological change that we want to see in the sector. Shipping is not unique in this. Everything we have done on land, I do not mean land transport, I mean everything on land, has been the result of stable, predictable policy framework. We have the renewable solar and wind taking over the traditional power generation sources. It's because they were European targets, national targets, and the technology that pre-existed in the laboratories and the drawing boards saw a new market. And as we live in a global market-based capitalist economy, since there is a demand which is driven by regulation, there was supply. As a result, the expensive renewables eventually became cheaper. Now they're competing very easily with coal without any support. The same we had with cars and in other sectors. For shipping, we need exactly the same. We need to have predictable framework for the technologies that are on the drawing boards now. Some of them are being deployed at small scale. For example, we have battery ferries already in Northern Europe, in Denmark, in Sweden, in Finland. We have up to 200 battery and hybrid ferries already sailing. We have small-scale deployment of hydrogen in shipping. One hydrogen ship is already sailing. Very small vessel, but that was the first baby step. And then more and more research, as well as the shipping technology providers, MAN Energy and Wärtsilä, they've already started the development of ammonia engines. Those will come, but they are at a risk of remaining in the laboratory if there is no demand for them. Nobody will invest millions, billions in technology production, fuel production, if there is no demand. For that reason, we need to have demand-driving regulations so that investment follows, as well as there's an uptake down the line. Shipping fuels, green fuels, hydrogen, ammonia are very expensive, but they can be cheap. For that, we need to have economies of scale, which will eventually bring down the prices. I will stop here and looking forward to any other questions that we might have from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, indeed, very much for your very concise comments. It's a very real art form to be able to take everything that's been said before you and boil it down to 4 very concise points like that. And I'm very grateful. Thank you indeed, Faik, for that. I'm going to move straight to the questions as they've been coming in, and indeed that came in before the session began. And I'd like to start, if I might, by directing a question, which is really 2 questions combined, to Jutta Paulus. It goes to the notion that including emissions within the operating cost of intra-EU vessel voyages will potentially lead to increases up to 10% in terms of costs. And then on the other side of it, there's an argument being made that there's a heavy administrative burden that will go along, and particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, smaller shipping companies would be unduly burdened by that with regard to an EU ETS. In respect of those issues, would you envisage some form of measures being taken to alleviate that? So in the case of the former, free allocations, as was done at the outset of the airline industry, and I know Simon doesn't like us making comparisons with the airline industry, but nonetheless, and perhaps in form of financial or other incentives for small and medium-sized organizations when they're competing with the larger sized organizations.
Well, actually, I'm not sure whether we will really have an increase in cost of 10%, because there have been several calculations on the actual increase in cost, and this would be more in the range of less than 1% if you calculate it down to 1 kilogram of freight, if you are using a container ship, for example. And these were calculations where the shipping industry was actually contributing to. So, but at the end of the day, it will be cost that is irrelevant of flag, irrelevant of owner, irrelevant of operator. So basically no one can escape, so to speak, this cost. And of course, this will be forwarded to the consumer, that's clear. But the calculations that we have seen were more in the line of less than 1 cent increase for 1 kilogram of bananas, 0.27 cents for the shipping of 1 iPad. So this is really going... In German, we say "es geht im Rauschen unter," so it's within the natural variation of prices. You won't see this increase. And secondly, yes, we have thought of the small and medium companies, very much so, because of course, we cannot expect a small company having maybe 2 or 3 boats and operating these to go to these fancy auctions, have even maybe a legal advice or anything like that. So what we are proposing in our legislative proposal is that if you are not taking, if you don't want to take part in the auctions, you can actually surrender the respective amount of money at the end of the year directly to the Ocean Fund, which will be investing in research and development of more efficient ships. So of course, we may not use the lowest price in the auctions, because then no one would go into the auction, that's clear. So we have to give an incentive also for companies to take part in the auctions. But for those that cannot handle this administrative or legal burden, they can just buy the allowances by the end of the year and have no hassle, so to speak, with that. One last very small issue maybe. Mr. Pröll said that there were no more free allocations in the ETS. Unfortunately, this is not the case. 40% of the certificates are handed out for free to the steel, to the cement industry, at the level of the respective benchmark. And of course, at the moment, we have no other option in order to keep those industries competitive on a global market. This is something that the Commission is looking at now with the carbon border adjustment mechanism. But there are the major part of the allowance, or not the major part anymore, but a very large part of the allowance, is 40%, is still handed out for free, and often the respective criteria are not very well defined. There is a very recent report by the European Court of Auditors complaining exactly that we should not hand out those certificates so freely, because as it is, there is no incentive for innovation. Thank you.
Alexander, did you want to come in and on that?
No, that's of course correct, and I wasn't accurate enough in my statement. Having said that, obviously the system has been improved quite considerably, and I think it is simply going too far to say, that there hasn't been, that the ETS regime as such would be effective. I think it can be an absolutely effective tool, but of course it very much depends on how you operate it. And no doubt, there are certain sectors which still benefit from loopholes, but they have to be closed on a step-by-step basis, and they will be closed on a step-by-step basis. So I wouldn't say that this is a general, a line of argument which puts into question the efficiency of the regime as such.
Just on that point, though, that's one of the topics that's come out very clearly in a lot of the questions is an assertion that the regime as it currently is, and I suppose Simon's slide with the jigsaw pieces put it together very nicely, is that it is quite a piecemeal approach. To what extent do you think, if you accept that there's a recognition of a growing need to more comprehensively regulate matters pertaining to the environment, would we be better to adopt a broader approach to this and rethink it from the ground up? Or is it going to be an effective solution, do you think, Alexander, to constantly address small piece issues rather than the bigger picture? And would we not be better to try and incorporate issues around competition law and perhaps tax law, as Faik also alluded to, as the best way to move forward?
That's a tricky issue to ask an international lawyer, of course, but from what I learned from environmental economists is that the emissions trading scheme can be a wonderfully effective system which can create the incentives that you do need. It hasn't been constructed and operated like that in the first years, no doubt about that, but it's still, I would consider, should be one of the main columns of a future climate policy. And I think this is exactly the way how it is developing. Does that mean that there shouldn't be any other mechanisms aside to it? No, of course not. But what I would generally argue is that all these instruments then need to be put on a coherent basis, and it needs to be safeguarded that the effects created by one regime are not counteracted by another sub-regime. And that seems to be a very problematic issue.
Moving on to an entirely different area, Simon, you alluded in your presentation to the fact that at Maersk you're slowly reaching the limits of what can be done. There have been several questions come in as to whether wind power might in actual fact still be an option that could squeeze out a few more percent. And I wonder what your thoughts and maybe what Faik's thoughts on that specifically are.
Thank you. But you know, it goes back to what's just been discussed a little bit, right? Do we still talk about shaving a few percentages off here and there, or are we talking about transition, right? Because it's all good to shave a few percent here and there, but you know, we should really be talking about how we transit to decarbonizing this sector. So is wind going to bring us to zero? Not on its own, and it's going to depend largely on the ships you have. So a container ship, for example, it will be very difficult for a container ship to use wind power for a number of reasons, right? But mainly due to practical reasons and where we're sailing. But for a tanker, for example, we're using Flettner rotors on Maersk tankers, and you know, we've put 2 Flettner rotors on one ship to test them, and they've actually delivered 8% in decrease of CO2 emissions and energy efficiency. 8%. That's not negligible. But those were put on the ship afterwards. So imagine if you could fit that into the actual build of the ship when it's being built, and then it could be more, you know, it could probably be a more efficient way of doing it. I'm not saying you put 4 on and you got 16%. That's not how it works. But you know, there's probably more together from wind when you look at the Flettner order, depending on which type of ship you're operating. So again, it goes back to what type of ship. I hope this answer made some sense.
Faik, did you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, just quickly complement what Simon said. Indeed, it depends on the ship type, the shape of the ship, its size, and where it sails. But I would say that wind technologies haven't reached their limits yet because they haven't been tested to their full scale. One good thing about wind technology is that it does not only save fuel, but it also helps ease the transition to zero emission fuels, which are going to be expensive. So if you're going to use expensive fuel, you're better off using less of it as opposed to a lot of it. In that sense, there is still a lot of space for testing the wind technologies. As Simon said, most tankers, they have installed 2, 8%. It is not huge, but it's not insignificant. And some analysis show that you can actually increase that dramatically by adding the number of additional Flettner rotors and so on. But Flettner rotors are not the only technology. There are other technologies as well. What is important, though, from a policy perspective is I just want to make a quick comment in relation to what Simon showed, that really nice jigsaw puzzle. I think that jigsaw puzzle has all the nice right ingredients. There is only one thing that is missing, that is energy efficiency. The energy efficiency is not in any of the upcoming European Commission proposals, but it is in the proposal that was developed by MEP Paulus. So that element needs to be taken up by the Commission when they are making their proposal, especially the fuel EU regulation that will be coming up in Q4 2020, and make sure that energy efficiency is not forgotten when we are talking about new fuels deployment in the sector.
Thank you so much for that. There's questions coming in thick and fast as it is now, and I'm certain we're not going to get to all of them, unfortunately, with the time remaining. One or two questions which we might be able to deal with quite briefly. What is your prediction for when the MBM debates might actually resume in IMO, and where do you predict that might go? So, Simon, you said you've been privileged enough to attend some of those, and where do you see that going in the future?
Yeah, it's not easy to answer that question, and to be frank, the situation, the pandemic that we're facing hasn't really helped the IMO progress either, because having to schedule meetings virtually with 150 nations isn't exactly easy. But hopefully, my hope is that at the meeting now in October and November, we reach some kind of consensus on the short-term measures, and then in the beginning of next year, we start digging into the long-term measures and the MBM discussion. We need to have a strategy ready by 2023, and that needs to have also long-term measures. If that doesn't include long-term measures, then it's a problem. Then I feel like we have failed on what we are set out to achieve here. So for me, it needs to start now, next year, early next year, that we start to discuss these mechanisms that can bridge the competitiveness gap between renewable and fossil fuels. So I hope that that's the time frame we're working with.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Alexander, a question for you. There was a question came in that wanted to know whether there actually have been instances of successful implementation of the polluter pays principle. The reason I bring this up is Jutta Paulus said in a statement, it was reported in the press at least, that it's about time that for the first time the polluter pays principle became fully operational and was actively implemented. And in this respect, are there any instances of applications that have been successful in the past that you're aware of, or indeed I would open that to all the other speakers to jump in if they're aware of them, and to what extent do other principles such as subsidiarity and precaution maybe have a role to play in creating more comprehensive and sort of effective progress?
Well, the problem with the polluter pays principle, of course, is that it is quite difficult to say who exactly is the polluter to pay. And that is, it seems to me, the course of the legal debate, that principle really is not too efficient in the effects that it may unfold, simply because it leaves to the states and the EU quite a broad scope of discretion. And if we regard it from that, then of course there have been successful implementations. And yes, in parts, I'm thinking about compensation fund solutions, some liability structures, which I think can easily be referred back to the polluter pays principle. But as I said before, that principle is really characterized by a very, very flexible understanding of what exactly, who is the polluter. And that is why it hasn't essentially had any, well, almost none effect in international adjudication, and also not in the adjudication of the Court of Justice of the EU to this day. So I seriously wouldn't put too much hope in that very principle.
Jutta Paulus, you have suggested that the person buying the fuel should be responsible in that respect.
Yes, this is true. So that was something that was very important for a lot of my colleagues who said that, for example, a shipping company that is hiring out their boats to a charterer, they have, of course, no influence on the way the ship is operated, whether it's fully loaded, at what speed it is going. So, of course, the person that is responsible for the commercial operation of the ship is usually the one that is buying the fuel naturally, and that they, of course, are also responsible for meeting the efficiency target. I would like to just very, very briefly come on one question that I saw in the question and answer, which is, why does no one consider, in order to have a carbon-free or nearly carbon-free possibility to propelling a ship, why does no one use nuclear technology? It's very simple, because there is no single technology that is as costly as nuclear. So nuclear is used when you need to be on the sea for a very, very long time, not being sure when or where you can refuel, like a warship, or when you're in places where there is no possibility to refuel, like at the poles. The icebreakers are fueled by nuclear propulsion a lot. But for any other purpose, nuclear is just much, much too costly. It's not a security issue, it's a purely cost issue.
Just one question while you mentioned the poles, I would actually immediately ask that, and it's probably a very niche area, in a niche area indeed, but to what extent do the severe ice conditions in the Northern Sea, in the Northern Baltic Sea, and winter navigation, to what extent those need to be taken into account when it comes to EU ETS for shipping? That's a question that came from Finland, I should say, so perhaps it's a very specific question for that region.
I really have to admit that I haven't thought about this, and this question also never came up when we were discussing among our colleagues. So very sorry, we might try to find out more about this. I think your question relates to the fact that you, of course, you need more fuel, and emit more CO2 when you have heavy ice conditions. But as I said, we have never thought about that. But of course, the same would be true for increasing fuel prices or a fuel tax or whatever. So everything that makes your fuel more expensive will have a bad effect on any situation where you need more fuel, of course.
Perhaps you could also just, while we're talking here, provide a few more details, a question coming in on the plans for the Ocean Fund. Who should manage it? Who would participate? Is it limited to the EU? Is it more global? Just general information on the Ocean Fund. I know you touched on it, but perhaps in a little more detail.
Yes, I mean, the idea is to have it not limited to the EU, and also not limited to specific whatever flag states, operators or whatever. But in my view, everyone contributing to the filling of the Ocean Fund should be eligible for applying for funding from the Ocean Fund. I think that's pretty logical. Of course, it's not the Parliament that would be responsible for distributing the Ocean Fund, but of course there would have to be a, let's call it, secretariat or committee of experts looking at the various projects, and also selecting those that are really worthwhile funding, because as we all know, and as fraud in the past and also in the present on EU funding. So of course we would have to have a good board of experts and also independent control of how the fund is managed. But the management of the fund would of course be done on EU level. How exactly would be for the Commission to decide. And what's also important for us, that 20% of the fund should go to marine protection areas, especially one of my colleagues, Catherine Chabot, who has been a professional sailor herself and who is very, very much attached to all issues concerning ocean biodiversity. She was the one that really pushed also for this issue and saying, we must ensure that we can halt the decline of biodiversity in the oceans, and we cannot do that as long as the marine protected areas are so much underfunded, because of course no single country feels responsible for them, at least not for those that are outside the single economic area. So it's very important that we have independent funding of these marine protection areas.
Simon, how does Maersk view that? You're nodding along. I imagine that you're largely on board with some of this, or is there a particular angle that you're coming at it from?
No, you know, the one thing that I would mention on the fund and the way that it and it's early days, so it's difficult to say how, if it's adopted, how it would be structured, etc., etc. But I very much agree to what's been said in terms of who could apply for it, how should it work, etc. I think that makes a lot of sense, that you don't, you know, exclude anyone from it immediately. We've had some examples at EU level where we've had some attempts at securing a shift, a modal shift from road to sea, and those have at times not been very successful because they've basically sponsored a competitive line that just disappeared afterwards once the money from the EU disappeared, right? And that's not what we want to do, right? If we really aim to lower CO2 emissions, if the Ocean Fund has to play a key role in that, then it shouldn't be used just to fund ship owners that have been sitting on their hands for the past 10 years and would like to have a new propeller, right? That's not the aim of it. In my opinion, that's an important part of it. You know, how do you actually define what projects are deemed to be okay to be financed or not, and how do you do? That's a fundamental question, I think, which will be interesting to look at.
Just to complement, we also included something, sorry, something on supporting shipping to remote outermost regions and islands, because of course if you have an island where, I don't know, maybe 87 people are living, and they would have to cover the cost for decarbonization of the shipping towards their island, that would be very difficult. So this is also part of the tasks which the fund should look at, short sea shipping, remoter regions, especially islands. But of course, it's not about applying already existing technology to ships that are totally outdated. But in my view, we should really invest in new technology that is not economically viable today and where it needs research and development. Thanks.
And just in a follow-on to that, to what extent, the question comes in, will the EU consider the notion of common but differentiated responsibilities through the fund, through the monies that have been gathered, as a way to sort of a balancing, I suppose, if you want to call it that?
Well, we're all talking about this fund as it would be starting on January 1st, 2021. So up to now, I would be very, very happy to actually defend our proposal through the trilogues with Council, and then have a final vote of both Parliament and Council and have it through. And then let's discuss about how the fund is set up and how many people are going to decide and how much money is distributed by whom to whom and all that. Up to now, it's only the Parliament's position that we should have this fund, and I'm expressing my own views how this fund should operate. But I'm very sorry, I cannot make any promises here.
I think it's quite often that the ears tend to prick up when there's money perhaps floating around and possibility for funding. But in any case, one final question to you then, what are the next steps? What are the deadlines? When will the trilogues happen? Is there any sort of I know it's very difficult, of course, in many areas with EU legislative processes to try and give any kind of reliable timeline, but is there a pathway that you could perhaps enlighten us a little bit as to how long it might take and when you would hope or expect to have a result?
Well, our problem is that we are not making the time schedule now. Right now, we have spoken with the German presidency, and they say, okay, up to now, the Council has not found a position to the Parliament's proposal, because, of course, they wanted to wait whether it really receives a majority. I can understand. So they will schedule a meeting of the Council so that the Council can find a position to the Parliament's position. Before that, it doesn't make any sense to go into trilogue, because the member states have to find their common position first, and then we can enter trilogue. So I hope that we will be able to have the first trilogue meetings before the end of the year, but that also depends on how are the budget negotiations getting forward? How are the climate law negotiations getting forward? What happens with Brexit? So there are so many ifs and hows and whens and maybes. I cannot make any real guess, any educated guess, so to speak. It's more like gut feeling.
Yeah, it's really like I should say in German, reading coffee beans or whatever the
Yeah, right.
tea leaves in English, I suppose. Thank you all very much. We have unfortunately reached the end of the allocated time. I do have another list of open questions, and there's so many more aspects to talk about that really are so interesting in this particular topic. I'm sure it's going to keep many of us busy for quite some time to come. I would like to absolutely express my deep gratitude and thanks to you, the speakers, first of all, for taking up your time and for agreeing at such short notice to be involved, and particularly to all the participants who are now probably rapidly leaving the meeting. But nonetheless, thank you to all of you for bearing with us and for putting up with another hour and a half in the afternoon and evening of a Zoom or Skype conference, Zoom in this case. And I would also at the very end like to express my gratitude to Lisa Penfold, who works in the UCL events team, who has done a fantastic job and supported me hugely in the last couple of weeks of getting everything up and running, and done a wonderful job in providing this platform to us. The recording and the slides that have been made available to us will be made available to you as soon as possible. And I look forward to maybe seeing you at another event again in the near future, hopefully in person. Thank you to Jutta Paulus and to Faik, Simon, and indeed to you, Alexander. Thanks very much. Everybody have a nice evening.
Thank you, Killian. Thank you for good moderation.